This lecture will focus on the Ottoman millet system. In this lecture, we will explore the Ottoman millet system. The Ottoman millet system is usually seen as a key example of a vast Muslim state or empire managing religious diversity successfully in the past. And so we will focus on this system and we will try to tease out its positive and negative aspects. Let us look at some models of managing religious diversity. In a state that is large or small with multiple religious communities, there are probably many ways of dealing with religious diversity. One model is to consider that all citizens as equal and to give complete freedom to each religious community to maintain its religious tradition and the freedom to practice it. This is probably the model that we are most familiar with today. There are many other models that different states experimented with in the past. And we see some examples of that even in our modern times. Empires or caliphates, by their very nature, bring under their umbrellas a vast array of people from different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. For such states, there had to be a way to manage the diversity. Some divided their communities based on religion, and if the community recognizes the ruling family and their right to rule, the religious communities were given freedom to practice their religion, and members of the religious community would be considered equal to others. We can see this in the practice of Mongols, for example. Some could not tolerate at all any other religions and could only conceive of one state having one religion. All others should conform to the state religion. That means no freedom to practice any other religion, and if one wants to live under such a system, one had to convert to the official religion or leave the territory. This could be seen as a model, for example, Spain followed in the 16th century. Some treated their religious communities as separate units and imposed a set of rules that give each religious community certain rights and freedoms to practice their religion in exchange for certain obligations, such as taxes. But the religious communities were not necessarily as free as the dominant religious group, or they did not have exactly the same rights as the dominant religious group. This can be seen in the practices of various Muslim caliphates for many centuries. The Ottoman millet system we'll be looking at falls into this last category. Let us look at the system. I'm not going to argue that the Ottoman millet system was perfect or even as a new system as such. But there is probably an argument for looking at this system as an interesting historical example for the management of religious diversity in a Muslim context. Let me first run through some of the basic features of this system. Then we'll think about the positive and negative aspects of the system. The Ottoman millet system was developed by the Ottoman state to manage its religiously diverse populations. The Ottoman Empire was the last Muslim empire or the caliphate to survive. It governed a large territory extending from Eastern Europe to modern-day Iran. Most people outside the Ottoman European territories were Muslims, but it was also home to many other religious groups, including Christians and Jews. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, it was probably the most powerful or one of the most powerful empires in the region, ruled by a series of sultans or rulers. The empire was eventually abolished just after the end of World War I. The Ottoman millet system, in summary, is about dividing the non-Muslim communities into recognized administrative units. Divisions were organized on the basis of religious affiliation, not ethnic origin. The term millet originally meant religious community, but in this context, it takes on a legal meaning too. What I mean by this is that the millet system was not just about dividing the population into its different religious identities or communities. It was also about giving those groups certain legal rights. The millet system granted religious groups a certain level of legal autonomy, as long as this didn't negatively impact on the Muslim, or rather Sunni Muslim character of the Ottoman state. So in other words, these different groups were permitted to enforce and enact their own religious laws without the intervention of the state, of course within certain limits. Let us look at some of the similarities between the millet system and early Islamic practice. The millet system was not an invention of the Ottomans. Many features of the system were actually extensions of the Zimma system that existed for centuries under Islam. One can also see some influence from the system that Mongols developed to manage religious and ethnic diversity in their vast empire. So just to refresh our memories and to give a little historical context, let's run through what the notion of the Zimmi referred to and how it came about. Well, the most important aspect of the government policy on Zimmi status is that it was a system of protection for non-Muslim communities. Initially, of course, this was for Christians and Jews, but then this was extended to other communities later. Before this system of protection was properly formalized, it was put to practice by the early Arab Muslims who were responsible for the Muslim territorial expansion in the early part of the 7th century. The Muslim conquests eventually led to the later on to the emergence of the Umayyad Caliphate or Umayyad dynasty, and later to the Abbasid dynasty. Under both these dynasties, non-Muslims were granted Zimmi status, so the Zimma contract continued. This integration of local Christian and Jewish populations into early Muslim polities was an informal process in the beginning. But over time, over a century or so, legal rulings and more systematic public policies were developed and implemented. This accommodation of the religious other or the non-Muslim meant that the Muslim state could benefit from the ethnic and religious communities of the lands they conquered and now they ruled. Generally speaking, non-Muslims could take on Zimmi status, live in Muslim lands, and in theory be exempted from Sharia or Islamic laws and any coercion to convert to Islam. So that means with freedom to practice their religions. The Ottoman Empire's main contribution to this particular way of managing religious diversity was that it regulated and institutionalized it in an unprecedented way. In other words, the millet system was new because it was a properly formalized government policy that stretched over a vast amount of territory. But importantly, the basic principles that this policy adopted came from the earliest days of Islam, and of course with some influence from the Mongols. Let's now look at the rights and duties of the millets. Take some examples. So if the millet system is a more formalized version of what we have already discussed, that is in relation to early Islam, when you begin to identify what the rights and duties religious other may have had under this new system. I assume you would have thought of taxes, jizya, for example. Of course, the paying of a tax is a crucial aspect of this system. Again, as I'm sure you would have identified, the groups divided into millets were expected to keep order and to respect the Ottoman state and Islam. In return for this, the different millet groups were allowed to observe their respective religions and were allowed to lead their lives in accordance with the legal and ethical guidelines of their own religions. This meant that the millets had two different types of law and governance. Ottoman officials and judges adjudicated civil and criminal cases involving Muslim and non-Muslim citizens. And at the same time, religious leaders were given the role of collecting taxes and effectively governing at the local level. This means religious leaders had quite a lot of power. So how did the millet system work in practice? Each millet was a legal entity that was given the right to decide religious matters concerning the organization of worship, for example. Alongside this, millets were given the right to deal with matters concerning the individual and family, such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. This meant that each religious community within the system had jurisdiction over significant aspects of the lives of its members. The millets were also responsible to maintain order in their communities. The religious leaders of each millet functioned as mediators between the members of the millet and the Ottoman state. They represented their communities in dealings with the Ottoman administration. In this way, they had both spiritual responsibilities and civic responsibilities for their community. In practice, the millets were not segregated from the Muslim population as such. They were not necessarily confined to different areas of the city or ghettos. In fact, the members of the millets were relatively free to mix in the areas where they lived and in the marketplace, for example, where they had shops adjacent to each other. In this way, Muslims and non-Muslims could socialize together and buy goods from each other. Interestingly, they could also be witnesses in disputes for each other. The Ottoman Empire did not force the members of other religious communities to assimilate or to become Muslim. It did not try to curtail the people's local customs or traditions or to change their identities or their religious law, which was so important to them. As long as the non-Muslims fulfilled their responsibilities towards the Ottoman state, they could enjoy a lot of the same rights as the Muslims. However, this does not mean that these religious communities had complete freedom or total freedom. Matters that concerned the economy or commerce as well as law and order were often left outside the millet's rights. The other feature of the millet system to keep in mind is that whatever religious rights were accorded to any religious other or non-Muslim community, they were always group rights, not the rights of individuals. So the rights are associated with communities, not with individuals as such. There was no right to choose which religious community to belong to, or there was no right for a Muslim to leave the Muslim community. This is just one example. What is most important to note is that the Ottoman millet system put arrangements in place for a form of self-rule by Christians and Jews managed by their religious leaders. They were not given equal status with Muslims, but they were considered worthy of protection and respect. And this respect seemed to allow many religious others or non-Muslims to rise to high office within the Ottoman administration. Similarly, many people from religions other than Islam became providers of specialist goods such as medical care for members of the court, and they were able to secure positions in areas such as translation or in the diplomatic arena. But it is also important to note that the Ottomans were Sunni Muslims, and they wanted to maintain a dominant Sunni Muslim social order. Let us now look at the establishment of millets. An interesting aspect of the millet system is that millets were put in place over time, in fact over a number of centuries. The Eastern Orthodox Church was the most important millet, and it was established in 1454. In 1461, the Armenian millet was established, but it wasn't until much later that the Catholic millet was recognized. That was in 1831, or the Protestant Christian millet in 1850. The largest and most prosperous millet recognized was probably the Jewish millet. representing about 200,000 Jews in the 16th century. It was an interesting millet because it had various local Jewish communities within it, such as German Jews, the Spanish Jews, the Greek Jews, and the Arab Jews. However, they were all overseen by the same chief rabbi, who was an official of the Ottoman state. Another important point to note is that there were no Muslim millets. The Ottoman Empire was primarily Sunni. The millet system did not recognize, for example, a Shia millet or other forms of non-orthodox Muslim schools of thought. As we can see, the millet system was an evolving model. It expanded and grew, recognizing different religious communities as they were encompassed by the empire. While this was a very successful way of managing things at the time, it must be stressed that this administration, or the Ottoman administration, grew unstable over time. And to the modern mind, its legal underpinnings were not what we would consider just. It is difficult to refer to the millet system as practicing an ethic of pluralism for reasons of justice and equality, but it still offers insights into the possibility of the reasonable management of diversity, that is, religious diversity. Let us look at some criticisms of this model. The Ottoman millet system certainly had its downsides that we mustn't ignore. As we know, special levies were imposed upon different religious groups in the form of taxes or special taxes. This is obviously different treatments for different groups, or in other words, a form of inequality. In some cases, specific forms of labor were also required of these groups. Some might argue that these two aspects of the millet system were necessary to ensure the religious freedom of each group. This might very well have been the case, but there are examples which suggest that certain restrictions were placed on personal freedoms that we should not ignore. Let me provide you with 3 examples of restrictions imposed on the personal freedom of the religious other or the non-Muslims under the millet system. First, in court, the testimony of a Muslim was always more trustworthy or acceptable than that of a non-Muslim. Secondly, some aspects of the Pact of Omar in terms of discriminatory practices still existed, and this could have significant consequences for religious communities. Thirdly, the most significant example is, however, the forced conscription of male children into the Ottoman military or civil service. This is about Christian male children. This practice was known as devsharme, or a blood levy. This policy insisted that the strongest Christian male children between the ages of 8 and 18 would be forcibly conscripted at certain times, of course, when the state needs them. These children were then converted to Islam and sent to the Ottoman capital for special education. Most of these children never got to see their families again. But what is important to note is that these children probably had a lot more opportunities as a result of this process. Of course, the impact on families would be horrendous. We should also note that some historians have given a rather broad critique of the millet system. They argue that the millet system allowed the state to control communities through their own religious institutions and religious leaders. And on top of this, that the religious hierarchies were given the power to control internal dissent without much or indeed any outside accountability. So this gave the religious leaders perhaps a lot of power, and this power was unchecked. Let us now look at some benefits of the model or the system. It is of course important to keep in mind the negative aspects of the millet system, but there were positive aspects too. Well, on a general note, the Ottoman rulers or the sultans tolerated Jews and Christians to a degree that simply was not matched in most parts of Europe at the time. I mean, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. In fact, religious toleration was rather rare in Europe at the time, and the Ottoman model was a refreshing take on the management of religious diversity. Despite what I mentioned earlier about the negative aspects of the system or the model, it cannot be denied that under the Millet system, different religious groups enjoyed a wide range of religious and cultural freedom, as well as considerable administrative, fiscal, and legal autonomy. The Millet system liberated non-Muslims from having to conform to the majority's identity or religion, in this case Islam. It was committed to the protection, promotion, and maintenance of ethno-cultural and religious diversity, and provided opportunities for non-Muslims to preserve, maintain, and express their distinctive cultures, lifestyles, and rights. Non-Muslims were by and large not restricted socially. Many rose to high ranks in their vocations. It could be natural sciences, medicine, translation, and administration, as well as diplomacy. They had religious and cultural freedoms and considerable administrative and other kinds of freedoms. It was somewhat an effective system for governing religious minorities in a large empire such as the Ottoman Empire. With the system, localized conflict could be resolved quickly and effectively. The Millet system offered a unique blend of rights for different communities while maintaining overall state power. And so, while it is true that the Millet system still limited minority groups' freedom in some ways, it is undeniable that the Ottoman system tolerated and encouraged a far more religiously diverse society than nearly all Western Christian states at the time. Just to illustrate the point a little more clearly, let me point to an example. In the year 1500, at the beginning of the 16th century, in pretty much all of Western Europe, including present-day England, France, Spain, Portugal, almost all people living there were expected to be Christian. In these places, religions like Islam, Judaism, and non-Catholic denominations of Christianity, in most cases, were severely persecuted. This is, of course, in places where Catholic Christianity was the dominant one. Around the same time, that is the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire not only tolerated but actually promoted religious diversity. For example, the Ottoman state specifically invited the Jews who were basically expelled from Spain to come and reside within the Ottoman Empire. As one historian points out, it is this comparison between the Ottomans' encouragement of diversity and Western Europe's violent discouragement that led philosophers like John Locke and Voltaire to celebrate Ottoman policies in their works on religious toleration. So the Ottoman system was seen as an example by a number of philosophers during this period, and of course a bit later. So I think we can say that the Ottoman example, or the Millet system as an example, was definitely not perfect. But in comparison to the practices elsewhere in that region, in particular in Europe, it certainly stood out as a state system that did not suppress the religious other completely. It was an empire that ensured a place for the other, even if some benefited more than others. Some historians may argue that the Ottoman Millet system was largely successful at the time because it was a pragmatic response to a lived reality. By this I mean that the Ottomans recognized that religious and ethnic difference was part and parcel of the territory they ruled, and that it made more practical sense to leave the diverse fabric of those cultures and societies largely untouched. But of course, there is no denying that religious conflict was also a fact of the time. And the Millet system actually allowed different religious communities to live together but separately at the same time. Historians may say that Muslim religious authorities encourage Muslims to avoid non-Muslims also. And similarly, Christian priests and Jewish rabbis are said to have recommended avoiding the Muslim as well. But people from all religions would mix in areas such as the market and other public places, and there would be a good mix of all people from different religious traditions in these public spaces. Of course, from the point of view of modern democracies that espouse principles of equality and non-discrimination, the lesser class status of Jews and Christians in Ottoman society would be unacceptable. But as I mentioned earlier, it is important to emphasize that in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, the Ottomans offered perhaps the least degrading and the most respectable treatment of their non-Muslim citizens, more than any other state in that region, by that I mean Europe. I think it is for this reason, perhaps many view this millet system of the Ottoman Empire positively in thinking about religious diversity in the context of early modern period. So, in summary, in this lecture, I tried to provide a very, very basic introduction to the Ottoman millet system with some indication of the positive and negative aspects of the system.